Welcome to Stories in Focus. My name's Ellouise Schoettler. I am a storyteller, but I'm the host of this show. And those who have watched it before know that the in focus part is that we have a storyteller as a guest. And today I'm really, really happy to bring to this conversation Fanny Crawford from Hagerstown, Maryland. And we're going to have some really good talking here, Fanny. Thank you for coming back.
Oh, thank you for having me back, Ellouise.
Well, it's always a pleasure, dear. Always. She has so many things. We'll just have to figure out what we're going to talk about. Fanny has her own radio show coming out of Hagerstown. She is the descendant of a fascinating man, T.H. Barnes, and she'll tell you about him. And maybe we'll go through another different thing. I'm kind of interested about something that she's accomplishing within her storytelling that she mentioned a little while ago. And we won't spoil that by giving it up until we're ready. Tell us about what's happening on the radio.
Well, it's a community-based internet station, and I do live in Hagerstown in Maryland, but the station, I actually go to Bolivar, West Virginia, just outside of Harper's Ferry, which is where the receiver and the broadcast equipment are. And I have a weekly show. It's Mondays at noon, but the best way to listen is probably by podcast, because then you can pick and choose which stories you're interested in. And you don't have to worry about constant technical difficulties that we run into.
That you cut out.
Yes, regularly,
Yeah.
Editing. So the podcast is talltales.enlightenradio.org, and that's really the best way. And there's probably close to 2 years worth of programs up there.
That's wonderful. So you've been doing this for 2 years.
Yep. And we try to have guests on a regular basis, but there's always at least one other person with me. Stash Zilkowski, who you know is my regular partner, but there's sometimes other storytellers also.
What's been the best thing for you
About the radio show?
Out of doing this job?
Well, it's that it's weekly, so I have to have a story every week.
No lazing around.
That's right. And, you know, sometimes I can tweak an old story, but it's a great, it pushes me for sure and gets me to stretch a bit. And trying to be topical, trying to be seasonal, trying to honor the tellers that we're interviewing or who are on with us. So I do revamp a fair number of stories, but just the pressure to have new material all the time has been really good for me.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about that.
Yeah. Well, that's what I've so experienced, you know, and appreciated about working with MMC TV. You know, the opportunities to do that, to sort of expand what you're able
new
to
material.
do. Yeah, but it keeps you running.
It does.
It keeps you running.
So far, I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, yeah. What is the most effective question that you ask somebody that you're interviewing?
Well, I always ask, usually I know, but I always get them to talk about what they did before they began calling themselves a storyteller and what route they took to get to where they are now. So, you know, we have dozens and dozens of librarians and teachers who become storytellers. But, you know, they're coal miners who decide people need to know what it's like in the mines.
Oh, that's terrific.
They're union organizers who want people to know that history. They're people who have worked as nurses or other kinds of caregivers who have stories from all the people that they've worked with.
I would imagine, because I've known Fanny for a while, that you know what I'm just getting ready to do. So why don't you trigger us into remembering what we may have heard before? Tell us how you got started in storytelling. What were you doing in those days?
Well, the earliest storytelling I can remember doing was with my mother. My mother was a very serious person. She was a librarian, so our house was filled with books. My dad was a book dealer at various times in his life, although that's not the only thing that he did. So I was hearing stories and honoring literature all of my young life. But the idea of watching my dad tell stories to make connections with other people, he was kind of a natural raconteur. And he would use stories to draw people out and to find the common space between whoever it was he was speaking to. And I started doing that within the family. Because my mother was so serious, I found that as the oldest child, family life went better if I could get her to laugh.
Of course.
So I loved to tell her stories about things that she had heard about, or that where she was there when the event happened, and she would say, "That's not how it happened. That's just a lie."
And so you just
And
got your chance.
Yeah, and I would just push her and prod at her to get her to understand that I was just being silly, or that I was changing things.
So what changed this approach to storytelling for you?
Well, I started writing down as an adult. Then I started writing down the stories that I had been telling my mother, or stories that I had heard my parents tell, and I gave them to her as little gifts, you know, bound in a loose leaf binder, things like that.
Nice.
And from there I started sending stories to my nieces. I had been telling stories to my daughter for a long time, and she's a science fiction storyteller in her own right. She tells a little bit of family stories for fun, but what she's really passionate about is science fiction. But my nieces were really interested in hearing about their brother, who of course is my baby brother.
Yeah.
So he was always the guy in trouble. He was always the guy doing silly, ridiculous things. And that was a lot of fun for me, and they were a great audience. And I was working with adults who work with kids. Most of those adults who work with kids understand the power of storytelling. So I started doing workshops to get them to share with each other how they were using stories. And that became just a whole world opened up for me, that the way that I tell stories is not the only way to do it, that all these other people are making up their own stories and tall tales for kids. And from there, I started working with Gail Herman, who was teaching at Garrett College.
I know her.
Yep.
Yeah.
She's now up in New England, but for decades she was at Garrett College, and she was teaching storytelling. And she did, for Autumn Glory Days every fall, she would have a storytelling festival kind of thing, and adults could tell, and then she had, it felt like every child in the school system in Garrett County would come up on stage and have their 7 minutes. So if you could sit through 100 children telling 7-minute stories, then you could get up as an adult and tell stories. And she was one of my first coaches, and she really helped me work on timing and story arc and things like that. And you know, if you say your story is going to be 15 minutes, it had better be 15 minutes. And she was very helpful with me just in getting me over my initial butterflies and nervousness about being up on stage.
It's so important to have somebody like that.
Yeah.
That will step up and say not just the good, but you know, how you could do it.
You have been a great mentor to me
Oh,
too, giving me lots of feedback, especially on my T.H. Barnes stories.
I happen to like him a lot, and you will too when you hear that, you know, and especially hearing, you know, Fanny do it, that bring forth that piece of the family that nobody's going to know.
Yeah.
I personally believe that that's extremely important to do. All right, so we have a little bit about her past. We know a little bit about the fact that she's on radio. But she was telling me a moment ago, and you'll hear more about T.H. Barnes, and she caught me up the last time I heard you, or the time before, I guess, because this has been it's in the works for some time, is that she speaks like him. And that brings him more to like. You've really learned to speak like him. And I want to know more about how you do that. And more than just how you do it, what does it take for you to do that?
Well, it takes listening to myself, first of all, because I don't necessarily hear when I'm speaking in his voice, I don't necessarily hear what you hear. It's different if it's coming out of your mouth. It reverberates differently in my head, I guess. and telling the stories over and over and over again and experimenting with the voice. I've been telling stories in other people's voices, or I shouldn't say it that way. I have been inserting other people's voices in stories for a long, long time. And some of those voices are not easy on my throat, or they're not, or on my body. I have to experiment with different sounds. So I'm working hard to get a voice for T.H. Barnes that I can sustain for a longer telling. So the longest I've ever portrayed him has been about 70 minutes, and I'd like to be able to get to 90 minutes. Not that anybody else is going to want me to do 90 minutes of T.H., but I want to be able to sustain his voice. So I've mostly used one of my uncles, the uncle that I probably know the best because he's the youngest, so he's still with us. And I don't know how long that will be because I think he's 95 now.
Wow.
My dad died at 91, and my dad was in the middle of their 8 siblings. And my dad's voice, of course, sounded perfectly normal to me, so I can't use him for my grandfather because he sounds like me to my ear. But my uncles, different from my dad, they spent their entire lives in upstate New York, so there's a different accent, there's a different pacing, different pausing than my dad. So I've based it on that uncle primarily, and a little bit on the aunts who were up there that I grew up with, because I first started practicing these voices with those aunts, my father's sisters, who sounded so different to me from the rest of my family that I was with every day.
That fascinates me, the fact that you started doing this by listening to this, but I want to go back and back up just a little bit to clarify. So the difference that you're talking about, your father being normal, that's accent.
Yes.
That's accent. Were you living in Maryland?
No, I grew up in Philadelphia, but my dad moved from Western New York, where the rest of the family still is, to Yonkers and New Rochelle, and then in New York City a bit. So by the time I came along, he'd been in World War II with African Americans from all over the country. He was stationed in Saipan with a black unit, and so he was hearing voices that were different than what he grew up with, and then living on the East Coast, coastal coast, rather than Western New York, which is the East Coast, but
Yes,
it's mountains, you know.
I know.
And it's a little more insulated. People don't hear or back then didn't hear as many different voices.
Well, you know, this is fascinating because you touched on something we've never talked about before, and I really haven't talked about with many other tellers. I know when I'm having a problem with it, but how the voices that you heard as a child and how you can interpret them have to do with where you were living and what the local accents were and all this. And I wonder if people really appreciate the difficulty that comes of trying to reinterpret that. Is it a job?
Yeah, I mean, it is a job. I'm much more attuned to voices now that I'm telling stories all the time. But I do think you're most able to replicate the stories, the voices you heard as a child. So you just get, it's like learning languages, I think.
Yeah, I
you know,
think it
there's
is,
a
too.
window where you can not only hear the difference, but you can replicate the difference. And if you let that go too long, it's much, much harder to do. I don't do a very credible Southern accent because I didn't grow up in the South, and the relatives that I had from the South had all been living
Out.
north of the Mason-Dixon line,
Right.
or west, by the time I met them. So I don't have that in my ear in the same way. Adam Booth coaches me on my Southern
On
accent.
your Southern stuff. Because I can remember, there are only a couple of stories that I ever do this, and it's my Aunt Catherine. I don't even have to think about her, you know, that I just know how she sounded
Yeah.
to me, and so that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's, really amazing, and I think it's important that you tell this and that we have a chance to tell our audience here that when you hear voices in a story, they worked for it. It's not that it is hard. We're going to take a break, but we'll be back, and Fanny's going to tell us a story.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for one. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
My name is Thomas Henry Barnes. And I'm here to tell you about July 13th, a Monday, 1863, and the New York Colored Orphans Asylum. This was a school and residence for 300 colored children, freeborn colored children, and as an orphan myself, I entered the institution in 1860. But on July 13th, 1863, President Lincoln had determined that more troops were needed to carry on the war, and he called upon New York to fulfill her quota of men. But Southern sympathizers, determined to suppress the draft, organized a mob riot. 3,000 men and women armed with clubs, guns, pardon me, 3,000 men and women armed with guns, clubs, and knives marched upon the provost marshal's office where the draft was to be held. They killed the marshal and the clerk and burned the building to the ground. Many brave police and firemen were mortally wounded trying to prevent the mob from destroying the building. All available troops had been called to Gettysburg to stop the advance of Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army from advancing into Pennsylvania. So for 3 days, the mob robbed, burned, and murdered. Hundreds of our people hid on rooftops, in cellars, and cemeteries. Adults and children were found dead where they hid. When word came that first day that the mob was marching to the New York Colored Orphans Asylum, the Superintendent Davies could not believe that human beings would target a children's school. But he was a prudent man. And we children were marched out the back gates, 10 blocks, to the New York 35th Street Police Station by a small army of police, firemen, and brave private citizens. On that trip, we saw a colored man hanging dead from a lamppost. Telegraph poles toppled and the wires cut. Barrels of oil pressed against the sides of buildings and set ablaze. Every home known to shelter a colored man or an abolitionist was marked for destruction. We 300 children and hundreds of other colored refugees were crammed into a police station intended for 35 men. Furniture was barricaded against the doors and windows. The mob made repeated attempts to enter the building, but they were forced back. The New York Colored Orphans Asylum was looted, torched, and burned to the ground. Chief O'Brien of the New York Fire Department was killed on the steps of the orphanage trying to keep the mob from entering the building. And so we lived with very little food in that police precinct for 4 days. Till Thursday, July 16th, when the first veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg returned to the city. These were Zouaves, a type of soldier peculiar to the Civil War. They wore uniforms modeled on Moroccan soldiers fighting for the French army. Blue jackets with red piping, fringe epaulettes, blue trousers, white wrappings above their boots, and caps, blue caps with 2 red feathers, went on parade. But these soldiers were begrimed, seasoned veterans. They were lined up down the walkway at front of the police station, 1,000 strong, bayonets fixed, and guns at charge. The commander of the Zouaves, standing on the steps of the high steps of the police station, shouted to the mob that still filled the streets, armed with clubs and bludgeons, knives and pistols, that at the first sign of disruption, his men would fire upon the culprits without reserve. We expected confrontation, but there was silence, the crowd in awe of those soldiers. We children were marched to police gunboats and taken to Blackwell Island. Below decks, there were sharpshooters on the banks. Blackwell Island in the East River, along with hundreds of other fugitives from the mob, refugees. The island dock at Blackwell Island was a scene of mass confusion. Many had died in those 3 days. Children were standing on the docks crying for their parents. Adults raced back and forth from end to end looking for their loved ones. We children were taken by the end of September to a dilapidated shell of a building on the high ground above the Hudson. The story of the renovation, of our removal there, supplying that building, that's all part of the public record of the new resurrected New York Colored Orphans Asylum after 1863. Our time leading up to and on Blackwell Island will stay with me forever. The friends that we made that summer, the ones who came away with us, and the ones who were buried there, will be in my heart till I die. I understood even then that we were part of history in the making.
I always like having you come, Fanny, and tell us these stories and recreate this wonderful man from a period and from a position in a period that we don't know.
He's
so
in here.
Important. Yes, it's so important to have him come back with us, I feel, you know. And I think the way that you bring these stories together, I want you to say a little bit more about the voice, because I really congratulate you. You know, you keep it up. you keep him going, and you've really created a persona of this man. You're a young woman, you know, whatever, as descendant, and yet you create this person. Talk about what you have to do in your head to do that.
Well, I have to put myself, well, I have to ask permission from him to tell his story and to use his voice as close as I can, since I didn't meet him ever. He died in 1942. I was born in 1950. So I know his children and his grandchildren. And he helped raise my father and most of the siblings from their family. So he's there in us, in all of us. But it is not my usual voice. And so I not only have to think about what words he would say and how those are different from my words, but I also have to think about how he would speak. And I sometimes do cough while I'm portraying.
I thought that was very authentic. Didn't you think it was very authentic?
So I find myself apologizing as TH would apologize. I'm up in years now, and the voice just gives out sometimes. But I have to pace myself. And so I am taking voice lessons to learn how to speak in his voice from down here, as opposed to up in my throat. So I'm learning that my first inclination is to speak from the throat when I'm portraying someone else. And I have to learn how to breathe deeply and speak from below as opposed to keeping the voice up high.
That's a challenge, because that really pushes anybody into doing it differently. And your talking has just been so natural. Our talking is just natural. We just are who we are, and we sound like we sound. You know, that's how it goes. Yeah. What's the biggest thrill that you get from doing him?
I love being in front of an audience and having people say they saw him, that they hear him, and they want to know more about him. So I remember hearing about him in my father's voice as a 5-year-old and being mesmerized, hearing these stories as bedtime stories. So I understand the fascination. I am also fascinated with him. And it always startles me, and it's a little bit of a buzz. It's like, oh yeah, they get it.
Yeah. I think that's the precious thing about it. I really appreciate and enjoy what you're doing, but more than that, you know, is that it's what people who work in genealogy hope for, that they can share with the children of today a knowing of the people, their relatives from before, and certainly that's what you're doing. And I thank you so much for coming, and we'll get her back. Yes. So come back. Thank you very much
Thank you,
for being
Ellouise.
here. Okay.